absolutely delighted to be here and utterly grateful to the Library, Newpont and the Garden Club for giving me the opportunity to share some of the fun I've had in digging up this bouquet of stories, as I call it. But first I want to thank someone very much separately, and that is Jean Schroeder. Jean, I hope you're there on Zoom. At least 10 years ago, it could be 15, at Newpont, you said to me at some point, gee, why don't you do something about gardens and art? And I said, what a great idea, wonderful. Well, it's taken me this long, but here we are. And I would love to, as people dedicate books, I will dedicate this to you and of course also to Fred. So I just want to show you a slide here that tells you have to be careful. The garden in art is not art in the garden. My story is about how have artists depicted the garden and what do these pictures tell us? Well, what is a garden? The word garden comes from the Latin hortus gardinus, meaning an enclosed area. In the very early days, not long after agriculture was spreading, around 12,000 years ago, people carved out small spots protected from the dangers of the outside world, often with some kind of enclosure. Such areas were used to grow fruits and vegetables, but if you had a little extra land and you had some time, you could indulge in using a safe space for enjoyment, and you can embellish it with shrubs and flowers. And you could do this both in the countryside and in densely populated cities. And as time went on, enclosures weren't always necessary. So while working in my own small garden, and this view is actually totally exaggerated, it's a wide-angle view, it's actually really a very small garden, and behind the fence doesn't belong to us at all. That is thanks to, in the distance, thanks to the land trust, we have a very protected view. So while working in my own small garden, I was thinking about the people who were doing the same thing hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Why did they garden? And what did they grow? And how? Here's a winter view that I just stuck in there. Was their gardening sometimes a hobby? And were they as obsessed with gardening as I am? Well, to find out, I decided to take a look at how gardens have been portrayed throughout history and what these images were telling me. And I'm happy to share with you my simple bouquet of stories that is the result. So I'm starting as long ago as possible, and that is in ancient Egypt. If you were an upper-class Egyptian, you could be assured of an excellent afterlife. After death, your body was prepared for eternity and wrapped very tightly in very fine linen and put in an elaborate case. Now, all of this was a very costly business. Your soul would always have a home to get back to after doing exactly what you had loved to do during your lifetime, including enjoying your garden. So, to assist the soul in these activities, paintings on the walls of your tomb and even miniature gardens set the stage. And this wooden box in the Metropolitan is a 4,000-year-old garden made around 2000 BCE, a new way of saying before Christ, of course, in Egypt. And it was found in a passage near the tomb of Bouquet, who was a high official in the household of the pharaoh. And I love this picture. This is what the archaeologists found when they were digging, and they suddenly found that the sand was leaving. It went down some kind of very narrow slit, and so they followed that slit and they found this previously unknown chamber in the early 20th century. So that arrow points to our box, our garden. Now, in the middle of the garden is a small pond surrounded by trees with red fruit, and they could be figs. The columns in the rear, there you go, look like papyrus stalks bound together. And the capitals at the front of the columns imitate bundles of lotus. They're on the top of those columns. Now, notice the three spots in case it rains. You can never be too careful, even inside a tomb. So this miniature garden was put in the tomb so Mequetref's soul could enjoy his garden during the endless time in the afterlife. The water in the middle may have helped him with purification rites, and the figs would sustain him. Now here we see another Egyptian garden in a painting from a tomb wall from around 1500 BCE. And funeral rites are taking place in this garden. On the lower register, two servants are pouring libations while waving incense, and here is one of them. And a boat transports the soul of the deceased. And all around are date palms and sycamores, while in the middle, large jars with beer and wine are cooling in the greenery. Above that, bread and cakes are piled up high. Sycamores, why? Sycamore wood was used for making coffins for mummies and was often planted near sacred sites. So let's let these lucky souls enjoy eternity while we jump 1500 years to arrive at an opulent 3-story house in Pompeii, not far from Naples. This house, here you see as it is more or less today, was built around the year 30 CE, about half a century before it was destroyed when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, spewing forth a flood of ash, pumice, and stone, covering the entire city. By 1750, excavations of Pompeii had started, and miraculously, many wall paintings were unearthed. And this is a painting from the house I just showed you. On one of the walls was this scene, and many kinds of birds are flying around. Here I'm zooming in on two of them, perched on the foliage. And they are so realistically drawn that today's serious birders can identify what they are. Now maybe the owner was a birder, we don't know. A bird bath beckons, and the scene is anchored by two small columns. Those are called herms. Such columns typically served as entrance markers. But on the columns, on top, you will see on these plaques, two sleeping women. Now what is that? Well, the Roman aristocracy was crazy about Greek and especially Hellenistic culture. They saw a lot of it around them in the many originally Greek settlements in what is now southern Italy and in Sicily, and they adapted the old stories as their own, they, the Romans. So the elegantly draped sleeping women may portray Ariadne, a very popular figure in elite Roman circles. You may remember the story. After helping Theseus escape from the labyrinth of the Minotaur, Ariadne was unceremoniously dumped by Theseus on the island of Naxos, where sleep releases her from her misery. And these plaques may well describe that moment. Ultimately, Dionysus finds her and takes her as his bride. Her posture is inviting, even somewhat erotic, and no wonder Dionysus is smitten. So that these reliefs indeed do depict Ariadne is even more likely because in the same house there is a painting of Dionysus and Ariadne on another wall nearby. And here the situation has already developed. Dionysus is making a pass at her. She is standing wide awake, a little surprised by the encounter with a tipsy-looking stranger, and she makes efforts to protect her modesty. Now, notice the dense foliage. Garden designers of today have not only identified many of the trees in this scene, but they can distinguish carefully planned layers of trees and flowers in this and similar scenes. And I have actually, in a scholarly journal, found a floor plan, if you can call it that, of the garden design that some professionals have created based on what they're seeing in these wall paintings. It's amazing. And you can see all these planned layers, and So we know that the Romans definitely used professional garden designers. And the upkeep of the gardens was professional also. Right here at the yellow arrows, you can see evidence of very careful slanted pruning. Now we will leave the Romans cultivating their gardens and move another 1,000+ years to arrive in England around the year 1575. And a monumental garden spreads out over a wide horizontal embroidered panel. It is, of course, the Garden of Eden, full of people, animals, and trees. And it is one of a set of 3 valances, probably used as what's called a tester of a bed. And let me show you what a tester is. Here on a very fancy bed, it is that strip of cloth, or sometimes wood, that forms part of the canopy of a bed, like in this very glamorous one. Now, in the book of Genesis, we read, "The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden." End of quote. At the edge of the river here is a big crane looking at the ducks and some very active fish in the river. Here we see God the Father in the middle, with a tiger and a donkey below him. To make sure we see who he is, we also see him here in a close-up at the top. He's descending from heaven here. Can you see that? He's sort of on his stomach sailing down. On one side are Adam and Eve, and they are wearing fig leaves that they have stitched together. Notice the dromedary below Eve. On the far right, we see Adam and Eve again, but this time with an angel with a huge sword. And of course, the angel is expelling them from Eden. But look at what they are wearing now. They are wearing garments that look like late Elizabethan dress. This was made in 1575, so go figure. The artist most likely followed the Geneva Bible of the time that says, and I quote, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig tree leaves together and made themselves breeches." So here we have them in breeches. So how is this made? Well, the smaller items, the fruits, the flowers, and the leaves were embroidered onto canvas, cut out and then appliqued to the dark velvet foundation. The bigger elements, such as the river, Adam and Eve, God the Father, and the angel, were embroidered straight onto the velvet with polychrome silk and metal threads. Now, in the late 1500s, we saw a huge increase in the wealth of the middle class in England, mainly thanks to the growth of international trade. And decorating your house became important. And embroidery was especially popular in Elizabethan England. And we still today have many pattern books and primers for technique in how to make such elaborate designs. Well, like Adam and Eve, we need to leave this paradise. And we're moving on to a garden in 16th century India. And this is an image from a Persian book called the Baburnama, which was created in 1590. On the right, in the yellow robe, is the first Mughal emperor, Babur, and he's overseeing the creation of a garden. A strong wall surrounds the garden, and several birds are darting around way up high. And on the left, a mountain goat is peeking out from some very steep mountains. Now let's zero in on Babur. This portrait, by the way, is from another source. Born in 1483 in what today is Uzbekistan, Babur was a descendant of Genghis Khan and of Tamerlane, and he had inherited the conquering gene. At barely 20 years old, he took Kabul and he slowly pushed southeast towards India where he established the Mongol dynasty in 1526. Now, although he was a ruthless conqueror, Babur was a man with an engaging personality, and cultured and witty, and a very gifted poet. And he loved nature and constructed gardens wherever he went. Around 1525, Babur wrote his autobiography, which is the Baburnama I mentioned earlier, which had become famous thanks to Babur's grandson Akbar, the emperor, who had it translated into Persian in 1590. And Akbar ordered artists at Akbar's court to make at least 5 copies of Grandpa's memoirs, each with over 180 illustrations. And our garden image is one of these. Now let's look a little more closely. Here is Babur in the yellow, holding the end of a plumb line. The bent-over man in green is holding the line taut, and the other end of the line is all the way over on the left, where it is held by the fellow in soft pink, while the man in green is paying it out. On the lower right, a gardener in red is brandishing a spade, and behind him, 6 other gardeners are all looking up at Babur, waiting for instructions. The man in front of the water basin may be holding a big plant list. On the far left, visitors who arrived on horseback are waiting to be led into this wondrous garden. Now, the design that Babur is overlooking, a 4-part garden defined by water channels, goes way back to ancient Persian gardens. It was easily adopted in Islamic countries, where the 4 parts alluded to the 4 gardens of paradise mentioned in the Quran. And the 4 streams represent the 4 rivers of Allah's paradise garden: milk, honey, water, and wine. Now, this picture is done on paper, either by a single artist, we don't know quite for sure, or it was made in an imperial workshop by a very small group of artists who worked together on one scene, we don't know. But they used very, very fine brushes with made of squirrel hair or kitten hair, and the red paint they used was vermilion or cinnabar. The blue was made with the very costly lapis lazuli, and gold and silver powders added sparkle. But frankly, the yellow takes the cake. It came from the urine of cows that were fed on the mango leaves. When complete, the surface was burnished with an agate, that's a gemstone. And this friction generated heat and pressure, giving the colors an added depth and luminosity. And today, the Baburnama is widely available in print. It runs to over 1,000 pages, and you can find it on Amazon. Babur loved writing about gardens in his Baburnama, and this is an example, and I quote, "Their oranges, citrons, and pomegranates grow in abundance. I had plantains brought and planted there. They did very well. The year before, I had sugarcane planted there. It also did well." End of quote. So today, there is still a Babur garden in Kabul, and it is one of the foundations, on one of the foundations of one of Babur's original gardens. And it's carefully restored by the Aga Khan Foundation to look somewhat like the old garden. Excuse me. Yeah. Well, the spice trade brought tulips to Western Europe. By the early 1600s, these exotic and until then unknown flowers had become a luxury item for the gardens of the affluent, a status symbol that was soon copied by the vast well-to-do middle class. And the Dutch in particular started to cultivate tulips. So here we have a large, lush garden. It's perhaps more a park, with a lot of activity. The place is full of tulips. It depicts the over-the-top tulip bulb trade and its crash in the Dutch Republic in the 1630s. the crash that was later called, the whole pit was later called tulipomania. The painter is Jan Bruegel the Younger. He is a grandson of the famous Bruegel of the Harvesters in Met. And he, the grandson, painted tulipomania in 1640, a few years after the collapse of the tulip bulb market in 1637. But look carefully. These creatures are not people. They are monkeys. Bruegel used a genre of painting called singerie, depicting the characters as finely dressed monkeys. Now, this was not a new idea. Monkeys appear in medieval manuscripts and often in the margins and in cathedral sculptures, and they are always shameless and impish creatures that are excellent imitators of human behavior. So Bruegel's satire of tulipomania pokes fun at the tulip traders and is a playful metaphor for all the folly in the world. The story unfolds from left to right. Here on the lower left, we see a monkey with an elegant sword amidst a mass of highly unusual and extremely expensive striped and ruffled tulips. These became highly sought after. They were given grand names, such as the Semper Augustus and the Viceroy. Now, in the 17th century, no one knew what made the tulip break out of its usual pattern. Trying to create such a tulip, and that's called a break, was like trying to win the lottery. In the hope of producing a break, some growers fertilized their field with pigeon dung, while others sprinkled the soil with their preferred pigments, or they tied a bulb that had produced a red flower with one that had grown white. But the real cause of the mutation is a virus, but that was discovered only centuries later. Now, behind our inspector monkey, covered dishes are carried to a group of monkeys enjoying a celebratory lunch on the veranda. And in the middle, the guy with his arms up, a deal has been concluded. The lucky buyer holds a large bag of money in one hand and a very rare tulip in the other, while in front of him we see a monkey with an owl on his shoulder. This did not mean wisdom, quite the contrary, because an owl sees by night and is blind during the day. So in the mid-1630s, the market for these special tulips was beginning to overheat. A few rare bulbs might sell for the same price as an Amsterdam canal house. And traders had even started to deal in tulip futures. It took just a few years for the bubble to burst, and in 1637 the market collapsed. This, on the far right, is the aftermath. In the front, you see a monkey who is urinating on tulips, mocking this tulip mania, while another one is in the dock wiping his tears. Tulipomania was one of the examples in the famous 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. You may have come across that one. But today's economic historians think that this crash did not upend the thriving Dutch economy as much as people traditionally believed. But of course, the Netherlands did remain tulip country, here painted by Monet in 1886. Now, let's move from the satirical to the sublime and have a look at Versailles. Please picture yourself in 1820 in Lower Manhattan, near City Hall, in this building, a miniature Pantheon. And pretend or try to think of yourself standing in the center of the big circular gallery, and all around you, you're seeing Versailles, that storied palace with its enchanting gardens. And note today it's in a specially built room or gallery, very large, in the Metropolitan Museum. So that is where I let it run around me, and you see this. And you see basically virtual reality. It is a late September afternoon and the gardens are bathed in a warm light with long shadows. When you turn around, you see the palace, and let me see if that will play, yeah. And the portrait and history painter John Vanderlyn painted this in 1819 in his studio in Kingston, New York, on many, many large strips of canvas. It is over 10 feet high and 165 feet around, massive. So a floor plan helps us identify what we are looking at. Actually, it doesn't help us, but it helps the people in the past when this was exhibited. We see fountains, sculptures, carefully manicured trees and shrubs, and a host of people milling around. Here, peeking out from behind the shrub, where my yellow arrow is, we see Vanderlyn himself, and he is pointing to a group of very important people. And they are Tsar Alexander I of Russia, holding a monocle at his eyes, and King Frederick William III of Prussia, with other dignitaries of the Holy Alliance who were meeting in Versailles in 1815. Now here a couple strolls by. He's in uniform, and that refers to the occupation of France at the time. And Vanderlyn gives him a big mustache. And here he gives us a detailed look at the current fashions. But note how on this flat picture, these people seem to be leaning forward. However, when you're looking in the rotunda, that is not the case at all. Then the perspective is perfect. So how did Vanderlyn do this? He used an intricate set of ropes that were strung from the center of his studio to the curved canvas. Then he projected the shadows of these ropes onto the canvas to create a two-dimensional framework. And to get the perspective right, he also used a sort of camera obscura, a tool with mirrors and lenses that was used by some painters to translate a three-dimensional image into a flat one that could be painted on a flat surface. Turning around, we see the huge palace once more. And let me zoom in. And I'm zooming in very, very far, so it's not very clear. When you stand in the Met, these figures, and that of course is King Louis XVIII and his people, these figures are really only a few inches tall. So panoramas, and the word means all sight, were invented in England around 1790. Most panoramas show famous cities, and the first one ever depicted Edinburgh. For a small fee, people could experience the thrill of being in a foreign place. And the concept caught on, and panoramas popped up all over the world. And these circular buildings soon became known as cycloramas and were as widespread as our modern movie theaters. Now this rotunda that Vanderlyn had built in City Hall Park to house his panorama and also his history paintings was really New York City's first art museum. However, Vanderlyn's Versailles was there for barely more than a year. The income from it and from other panoramas was disappointing because it's very cumbersome and costly to change the scenery. And ultimately, no one could make money with them and they fell out of favor. So Vanderlyn took the panorama down in 1820 and tried to show it in other cities without much success. And after more than a century in storage, it was donated to the Metropolitan Museum in 1952. And the Met built a gallery to house it, and it is open to this day. The rotunda, this building, was finally demolished in 1870 after having served different purposes. Mainly, it housed city agencies. Now, today, interestingly, panoramas are getting popularity, are again gaining popularity, thanks to elaborate digital imaging and sound. And maybe you have seen that incredible panorama of Pergamon by the German artist and architect Yadigar Assisi. I think they are trying to create this permanently in Berlin. We saw it in Berlin years ago, and then it traveled around the world. Of course, IMAX movies are doing something of the same today. So let's move from the grandeur of the Gardens of Versailles to a very simple picture of an iris garden. Here we have an iris garden from Hiroshige Utagawa Hiroshike's series, 100 Famous Views of Edo, with Edo meaning roughly the present-day Tokyo area. The iris garden is part of a larger landscape. This particular one was known for producing flowers for the Edo market, especially a type of iris that was ideally suited to the area's very swampy soil. So our eyes are led into the scene by the strongly cropped foreground and the three carefully detailed specimens of iris. And in the distance, quite small, sightseers are waiting in a large wet iris garden. Hiroshige, the painter, noted that so many lovely women from Edo came to view the blossoms that it was difficult to distinguish which were the real flowers, the people or the irises. Of course, the design is minimalistic, created through simple line work and strong shapes, and finished with bold colors. This style is called ukiyo-e. It is a type of woodblock printing and painting dating back to the 17th century in Japan. And at the time, this new, very simple art style strayed away from the traditionally hyper-realistic artwork that many artists had strived for. This style was flourishing during the Edo period from the 17th well into the 19th century. It was, in Japan, a period of internal tranquility. Politics were stable, the economy was thriving, and Japan was shifting towards a more urban culture, and the population was growing. So in homes across Japan, this ukiyo-e type of artwork became popular and also affordable. It was a minimalist depiction of the culture, of people's daily lives, and of nature. And here is the artist, Utagawa Hiroshige. Hiroshige is recognized as a master of the ukiyo-e woodblock printing tradition, having created 8,000 prints of everyday life and landscape in Edo period Japan. And much of the work focused on landscape. In this charming print of yet another garden by Hiroshige, we clearly see the different shades of blue in the sky. It starts with very dark, gets gradually lighter. This is extremely difficult to do in a woodblock print. The artist has to apply a gradation of ink to a moistened wooden printing block rather than inking the block uniformly. And this hand application had to be repeated for each sheet of paper that was printed. It's called bokashi, and the translation is varied gradient printing. On our first slide, we also see that clearly. Now, Hiroshige's phenomenal output of 8,000 prints was somewhat due to his being paid very little per series, so he just had to keep going. But that didn't deter him because he became a Buddhist monk in 1856, so he would be taken care of. And there he completed his brilliant 100 Famous Views of Edo from 1856 to 58. And that was the year he died, in 1858. Now that is just about 10 years before Monet, Van Gogh, and a host of other Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters became eager collectors of Japanese art. So let's have a look at Claude Monet. Here he is, in a self-portrait in 1886, and he's 46 years old. And I think many of you immediately think Monet when we talk about gardens in art, and rightly so. Monet grew up in Le Havre on the coast of Normandy, and as a teenager in the mid-1850s, he is making some money to help his family by creating and selling caricatures and portrait sketches. Only later did he branch out in landscape painting. And he went to Paris at age 22, and there he joined the studio of an academic history painter and met several of the future Impressionists. Now, Now, mind you, photography was alive and well in the 1860s. So many painters now felt free to go beyond objective depictions of their subjects, and they portrayed everyday life exactly as they saw it. Monet found his calling. His big thing is light and atmosphere. Later, he himself called this the envelope. In this way, painting of 4 women in a garden, dressed in the latest fashion. The sunlight is streaming through the foliage, creating strong shadows. This is not about the women as individuals. Actually, Monet's fiancée, Camille, posed for 3 of the 4 of them. This is about the enjoyment of being outside in a charming environment. And this view of Monet's house in Argenteuil exudes Monet's delight in his domestic setup. Camille, who is now his wife, steps out of the door. It's actually quite hard to see there on the right. I don't have a pointer here, but I hope you can see her. Their son Jean is playing with a hoop. But these 2 are not the main focus of the scene at all. The warm sunlight on the shrubs and flowers is center stage. Now notice the big blue pots. The Monets move frequently, and each time they take these blue pots along. You will see them again. This painting is all about atmosphere. The luncheon is over. Some wine is left in the glasses, the bread is torn, the tablecloth rumpled. And a hat is stuck in the shrubbery. I had a hard time figuring out what it was until you get it in your eye there with the black ribbons. And Jean is playing on the ground, and Camille and a friend stroll in the distance. A parasol is left on the bench. Shrubs in bloom give off a delightful scent, and we can feel the warm sun and the cool shade. Who wouldn't want to have lunch in this garden? Now, the house in Argenteuil, with a couple strolling near the fence, is the background for the dahlias in full bloom, in a range of bright colors. Here, Camille Monet is sewing with a small child next to her. The girl is looking at a book, and Camille's head is bent. We don't get a good look at either of the faces. The features are not detailed, and this is not a portrait. But Monet's delight in his wife and his wonderfully colorful garden is clear. Here, a tall tree and an exuberant mass of gladiolas or hollyhocks, we're not sure, in the center of the painting obscure the house. Camille is walking on the side, but here her presence is somewhat ghost-like. And that may be because by now she's becoming sickly. She will die just 4 years later. Indeed, Camille has died, and Monet now enjoys the company of Alice Rochedet, a mother of 6, who has been helping Monet during Camille's illness. They have moved to Véteuil, further away from Paris. Monet's new surroundings are a font of joy for him, a new garden to paint and to plant, because he does a lot himself, or with gardeners at least. So notice the blue flower pots. 2 boys and a woman are coming down the garden steps, but again they are in no way the main focus, which is the light on the huge sunflowers. Now here, the same spot exactly, but now at different times of day. This is what will become one of Monet's most enduring interests, painting the same scene many times in different light and different weather. His series paintings, as you may know. He becomes gradually less interested in including people in his paintings at all. Now in 1883, the Monets move again, this time to Giverny, where Monet will stay until his death in 1926. And the gardens in Giverny become his main subject, creating them physically with the help of gardeners and especially painting them. Let me show you a few. His garden in winter, 1885. A path lined with irises, here 1900. And somewhat later in the season, he paints the maiden path to the house. In 1893, Monet starts creating his now so famous Japanese-style water gardens, and he will paint these during the rest of his life. Now, not only does Monet create and paint gardens pretty much non-stop, he also loves to talk about them with his friends and visitors, and he sends them cuttings and seeds and bulbs. One friend wrote to Monet in anticipation of a get-together with Monet and his close friend, the painter Gustave Caillebotte, and the letter says, quote, "We will talk gardening, because as for art and literature, it's all humbug," end of quote. So to finish my bouquet of stories, I needed one last stem, a bold and bright one. And for that, I chose David Hockney's garden paintings. This is painted less than 10 years ago. It's David Hockney's garden near Los Angeles. And I feel that I'm invited by an exuberant host. Here is the man at age 80. And I love this one. Here he is again in a recent self-portrait. He's now 86. We enjoy this explosion of color and shapes. And we walk on that red path to his house near the blue terrace in the distance. It's basically an immersive experience. Here we have reached the terrace. And now we see the garden from a different angle. Flower pots filled with succulents on the railing. Here, Hockney plays with perspective. We see the garden from slightly different angles all at once. And that is because Hockney considered one-point perspective, and that is the way a camera sees, as an unrealistic way of portraying the world, because we have two eyes and the camera has only one. And Hockney wants to show us what happens when you use these two eyes at the same time, always moving, shifting ever so slightly over time, more the way we are actually looking at things. Now, throughout his entire life, Hockney has painted what's in front of him, and that is enough for him to find joy and meaning in. Yes, he's traveled all over the place, all over the world, but his own backyard led him to this innovation of cutting off the corners on the bottom, the left and the right, in order to force a reverse perspective. He feels free to do what catches his eye, and he continually pushes the boundaries of his practice, even today at 86. He has embraced drawing on an iPad, for already 10 years. And one critic calls him an 8-lane highway because of his extraordinary versatility. So by now I have finished my bouquet, and like a bride at her wedding reception, I now throw it out to all of you to enjoy. And I will be delighted to answer any questions you might have. And here's a little recap of the paintings I've talked about. Thank you for listening.